we are Kulturfolger, and we are a small team. So we have Marcel, who's our team professor, Leclerc, and we have Renata also, who's just back from Mexico. But we started the space kind of trying to initiate conversations and provide multiple perspectives. So really looking into multiplicity. We started in 2015, and 2016 we made a publication which you can see on the table over there. And the publication was kind of around the idea of many natures. So we started looking at what was this idea of nature and culture, and kind of explore it and explode it. And so we've been kind of working on that through a series of different themes and different ideas and different access points. So art is one of our access points, and this month our theme is void. And for the year, the kind of overarching topic was the uncommon. And so for this month we had an artwork here that's by Huber, and there are several stones that are reflective and kind of looking at this idea of what is void. So we kind of use artworks, we use philosophy, we have speakers that come and kind of intermix this idea so that we can have many different things to play with and kind of discover for ourselves what are these ideas about, and how do we look deeper into them, and kind of what do we discover. So it's really kind of, we said this year also digging for gold. So a lot of times we're looking for different things, and our curatorial practice also tries to really interface. So we're not just facilitators, we're actually really trying to engage and interact in a way that provokes dialogue, provokes a discourse, and begins to kind of act with each other. So, I'd like to turn it over to Petra, who will introduce Eliza.
I'm very glad, first, Eliza, for being here, and Hans, who was our link to Eliza, that kind of made it to happen. And I will shortly introduce the topic of our lecture, of your lecture today, and it's about fieldwork. As you say, it's a race against time, a full immersion in the lives of dozens of people, and kind of a solitude, cognition and self-experience, planning and implementing. Fieldwork means also a confrontation with personal and practical shortcomings that are generally avoided and eventually vanish in written, sad explained, interpreted, often ethnographer. So Eliza, she's a cultural scientist based in Berlin, published on issues such as perception and representation of space, urbanization in South Asia, ethnography, the correlations of formality and formality, as well as on Lefebvre's theory of production of space. In her forthcoming monograph, this is an exclusive, opportunity for you to hear about it, called the Archipelagos. Urbanization told by people on the move. She focuses on movement and translocalization in, from, and around Bangladesh and West Bengal. So I leave the floor, and we can have a little discussion later on.
Yeah.
So
thank you for inviting me. Thank you for being here, although the weather is so nice, and maybe it's less nice to talk oneself in a darker room. As announced already, I am going to read. Something that I think is very, very rarely written, and it has to do with the fact that in academic practice, sometimes very strikingly differently from artistic practice, there is a kind of consensus that you present only the good and operationable and useful experiences and evidences of a work, and in the process of researching, on the contrary, you come across a lot of things that are useless or saddening, or confront yourself with shortcomings and with limitations, personal, practical, theoretical, and yeah, normally, as you already said, they are avoided, that was the link, in the practice of writing, and in this self-understanding of scientificness. So when you do field work, which is engaging with empirically with a field, whether it is, I mean, we can call field work, and it is totally legitimate to talk about field work also when you do archival research. You spend a lot of time in an archive, and that's already field work. You are trying to find an access into the field that is largely or in part still unknown, and from which you hope to gather some knowledge that is usable and makes some sense for others. So when you do fieldwork, you really, and I think I have become addicted to that, you confront yourself with a lot of things, and in particular with yourself. That's one other reason why when we, as non-artists, but as academics, put down everything on the paper, we know that students normally are going to read it, hopefully, and someone else. We think, okay, this is not important. This is not important. It is my personal experience, and yeah, then it is just forgotten. And I was, on the other hand, thinking that I need to speak about, because this is another practice of good ethnographic work, or of good empirical work. I knew that I am expected to speak about how I did it. I mean, you are supposed, either in the beginning, more normally in the beginning of a book, to say, look, I have this question, and then I have devised these ways to tackle it, and I have gone there and there, and then I have asked these questions to 100 people, and these people were women and children, and so on and so on. And that is kind of the important part of methodology that is important to be made transparent, because it's part of the production of knowledge, how you, so to say, use the field, and how you, so to say, gather the knowledge. But since there are very common and accepted, although continuously dynamically developed, understandings of how to make field work, and there are disciplines, anthropology, ethnology, sociology, that concentrate on doing fieldwork and gathering knowledge via fieldwork, and have devised methods for that. So normally you just repeat that you have done this, as prescribed by this and this, and that you have done it like him or her, and adapted. So I was confronted with the dilemma of not wanting to do that, of knowing that all the methods, maybe I applied all of them, and on the other hand, I never had the feeling that I am applying a method, because I'm just reacting to someone that I want to talk to, or I am improvising with a lot of honesty, with a lot of concern for how I am going to use the things per se. But basically it is a human relationship that you undergo, and so I decided that instead of writing the methods and how well I applied them, I will write about the failures. And via writing about the failures, I could also describe a little bit how it worked. This is the genealogy of these lines that I'm going to read out. And as said, the book is not even in the press. I mean, it is going to go through a process of copy editing in the next month, and it will come out. So, but it is finished, and you're the first to listen to one small part of it. That is, then I decided to put it at the very end. Because as the title says, it's stories of people on the move, and those are in the beginning, and then I thought, okay, let me speak about the untold stories, those that I would not tell at the end. And then a little bit about my research. For many years, for 10 years, I am traveling a lot to South Asia, and in particular to Bangladesh, which was the first station. I engaged too much with the capital city of this country, Dhaka, then little by little also switched a little west from Bangladesh to the Indian part of Bengal, around Calcutta. And as you may know or may not know, before 1947 there was one subcontinent under British colonial rule that was called India, and in 1947 there was a partition. And from that moment, one part, the eastern part of Bengal, that used to be the most populous, and for many years it also hosted the capital of the British Raj, Calcutta, was split in two. The eastern part was called East Pakistan because it was joined to the Pakistan that we still know today, on the ground of demographic distinction of a population that was Hindu and Muslim. So on the eastern part, demographers had counted 55% of Muslims at around beginning of the 20th century, and on the other hand there were only 45%. So the British say this is Muslim and this is Hindu. Thailand on Hashan, divide and rule. Same a little, very broadly and politically correct way. This is the way that India was partitioned. So the good thing is that the entire region still speaks the same language, which is Bengali, and I speak that language. I have learned the language, so I have access to the people that normally are rather cut off from communicating with foreigners because they don't speak English. Yeah, so I think I have said everything. I have said everything I wanted to say before, and I have put together some photos and some other illustrations, one small video, just to help you to imagine, although probably you can imagine already. And although I hope that the written also creates images, but the first 5 minutes are just a slideshow. I will not comment it, but in case we shouldn't know what to discuss about after this lecture, I would say you can pick one photo and tell me and ask me for the story behind the photo, because each of these photos have a story that is also not told, but each of them has a story that pertains very much to fieldwork. Oh, pardon. think it was not anymore. There were not so many, I hope. Sorry. I did forget 3 things. First, the second part of the title of this lecture is Untold Stories from the Ganges Delta. So, I have already said I was moving between Bangladesh and West Bengal, and this entire region represents or corresponds to the delta of the Ganges, one of the biggest rivers of the world, and this is one reason why there is so much water that you could see in the photos. Also one reason why a lot of the means of transportation happened on boats or on ships. And the region is located in a tropic monsoonic part of the world, which is the reason why the soil is often very muddy. And the soil plays an important role also in the research. The third thing I forgot to say was I was dealing actually with migrants or with circular migrants. I mean, in sociology, the denomination is circular migrants. I decided to reject that word. I call them people on the move for many reasons. I don't need to talk about those now, but I come from everything started from the consequences, from the consequences or from the insights I gained after my PhD, in which I have actually engaged, as I say, with Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh, and in particular with the production of space. How do people manage to produce space, and in particular social space, in everyday life? This is linked on the theory of production of space of Lefebvre, and in the aftermath of that research, in which I have been very city-oriented and also city or centrality-oriented, thinking that everybody is coming to the city. This is also the narrative of the urban age. Half of the population of the world is living in the cities. So we tend to look at the cities as the places where there is growth and where everybody is going to, but I had started to live in a bosti, which is an informal or self-organized settlement in the city, in my post office, and I realized that there were seasonal fluctuations. A lot of the neighbors disappeared in the seasons in which there was harvest, for example. Other neighbors would arrive and then leave again because they had another job in a brick kiln, or because they alternated 2 jobs in 2 cities. So I became interested in the fact that apparently not everybody was coming to the city, but there was a coming and going from and to the city that made the city very, very porous. And not only the city border porous, but the city as an entity porous. It fascinated me that I would have not to speak about the center anymore, and that I had to look outside, following the movement, and that was the beginning of the long process of movements in the in the country that Bangladesh is, and in the state within the Indian Federation that West Bengal is. And as you saw, I tend to disappear at some point, but there are some photos with me, portraying myself, and it is because I was accompanied by 2 persons in West Bengal and in Bangladesh who helped me. In Bangladesh, it was also a question of insecurity. I didn't know whether I speak Bengali well enough to make it, because I had already been learning it and practicing it and using it during the PhD, but I had during the PhD period assistant And while I was living in this bostey, I really learned a lot because there was nobody around to help me with translations. But since I wanted to really collect stories, I was afraid I would not be able to grasp what is told, and especially in the first period, which was for months in Bangladesh, that was the reason. And then I also realized it was good that there was someone with me, because we arrived to some very edgy places, and although I am very tall and I look very strange to most of the Bangladeshis, I still am a woman, and this is sometimes an issue, and it was good to be with someone. I mean, there was no security issue, or nothing happened actually, but I realized in going that it was good, very good to have someone to talk to. And in West Bengal, in Bangladesh it was a sheikh, and in West Bengal there was a woman, a friend, Pia, who will come after also in the lines I'm going to talk, to read now. That's it. So now, and I'm very nervous because you're really the first audience. What is fieldwork? Hours spent looking from buses, boats, ferries, rickshaw vans and trains at landscapes where the urban and the rural, pushed-pulled, once again one against the other by people's movements, are making way for new habitats. It's searching horizons, checking train schedules, bargaining bus tickets, walking on highways and kacharasta, and learning from commuters and seasonal migrants how to save on the transportation costs without spoiling precious time. Comparing tracks and speeds on a GPS device that continuously ran out of power, and imagining how fields and hamlets and rivers continued behind the border, guessing the slight differences due to the progressive substitution of sandy with clay and red soil on mountains. Struggling with the many dialects that coexist in this region, funny and fatal misunderstandings, delays, the joy of a handmade snack or a lime juice served at arrival, dirt, exhaustion, constant alert, sand of the construction sites and sand at Fort Kochi, the magic of Bengal's elevated hamlets amidst the misty green of endless rice fields and the beauty of its people's large smiles. Coping with humidity, mosquitoes, crowded marketplaces, aching lives, or with the myriads of reasons which influence the departures of people on the move, for dooming one to arrive just 1 hour too late and miss them for an entire season. Inventorying the gifts, utensils, and merchandise carried home. Documenting the changes in behavior, body language, and communication when passing from city to village. Learning when to take photographs. Adapting to daily routines and seasonal cycles during planned or unplanned stays in villages and small towns. In short, a lot of doings, with a disturbingly high potential for heroization, when on the contrary, for me, fieldwork has always been a humbling kind of circumstance, an emergency. It is failing, it is self-cognition through failing, it is stretching one's capabilities and sometimes being stretched to one's limits. So just as each and every phase of fieldwork in my memory is linked with specific localities, persons and research questions, as much each of them relates to things incommensurable and shortcomings. These shortcomings are generally avoided and eventually vanish in the written, said, explained, interpreted of an ethnographer. I'll invert that practice and focus them, the failures, and recuperate stories that I couldn't, wouldn't tell. And while I'll be doing that, I hope the slides may provide some less often seen impressions. Things incommensurable applies to situations whose sadness left me speechless, knocked me down intellectually and personally, things that one doesn't see change, things that hampered the research, and always, if invisibly, also the relationships. Instances like that in Janusz's veranda, after which I couldn't get back to work for one afternoon. It was June 2013. Pia and I had returned to Raninagar, the village, to continue our conversations with Solijuddin, as well as to carry out a preliminary mapping of the households whose members went to work to South India. In the lazy heat of noon, Solijuddin's 3 sons, one 6, one 4, one 2-year-old, had gathered in the veranda with their cousin, Janusz's first son, who, though barely 1-year-old, was already much sturdier than the youngest of them. The 2 elder boys had just come back from school, carrying each a bowl of hot, creamy khichuri, which is a lentil and rice meal. Sitting, lying, hugging each other on a mat, all 4 were now delightedly cross-feeding each other. We, I, Pia, and the 2 mothers, looked at them silently from another spot in the veranda, close to the corner where Janusz's mother was calmly cleaning off the unasked rice. I saw my sister as a 2-year-old, our cruel cuts, later so embarrassing. I had almost lost myself thinking of a similar picture the 2 of us might have offered to our mother those days, when the smallest of Solijuddins brought me back to the present, departing himself from the group. Unnoticed by the others, he, the tiniest, was fleeing with one of the khichuri bowls. Through the veranda, off the plinth, down on the sunlit courtyard, where turning fed to ensure nobody was after him, he inadvertently inclined the vessel, pouring most of its content. Even before he could react, his mother was by his side. Quickly, with one hand, she collected the khichuri from the dusty ground and, pulling him with the other, left the paternal house, her head down. Pia and I, namely, had been watching, probably her mother and sister-in-law too. And if a child's hunger is heartbreaking, carrying the shame for it is impossible. Shortcomings, personal and practical, there have been many. They were due to difficulties at communicating, at times at coping, and they are responsible for important gaps in my book. There should have been stories of movement caused by anthropocenic intervention and not climate change in the complex river system of Bengal to start with. I have, of course, heard of Jamuna's, or Jamuna is also Brahmaputra, Jamuna is the local name of Brahmaputra. And Brahmaputra, among the rivers of the entire subcontinent, is the only river who is connoted, or who is a male. All other rivers are female, but Brahmaputra is the male river because it destroys. I have, of course, heard of Jamuna River's tremendous attacks on its western shores, and knew, thanks to colleagues and existent reports, that land erosion in this context is a euphemism. If the river always flooded and destroyed surrounding lands, its violence even grew after the Brahmaputra Right Bank Embankment project, funded by the World Bank in the 60s. In the last decades, increased deforestation in the eastern Himalayas has added to the risk factors. In early November 2012, after a normal monsoon without particularly conspicuous accidents, Kalu Bishwas, a labor rights activist, brought me to Sharia Kandi, where Jamuna had just reclaimed part of the village. I want to try to render in words the compelling impression of the broken soil, the river that started 7 or 8 meters lower and seemingly continued ad infinitum, the children playing before an evacuated NGO school, all under a wet sky that could have crashed onto all of us at any moment. Kalu, noticing my perturbation, made a soft but tremendously sad comment. Nowadays, even Ganges, is destroyed. His words surfaced months later, when I was already on the other side of the border, though I should speak of a liminal area, as from Farakka, Bangladesh is maximum 10 kilometers away, and the neighboring state of Jharkhand just beyond the Ganges. Our guide in that heterotopic space, crossed by smugglers, Nepali immigrants, and dubious traders, was Kedar Mandal. For 4 decades, he has campaigned against the barrage built by the Indian government in the locality of Farakka, causing erosion and reallocation of land with consequent displacement of thousands of families. Why shouldn't she be angry? Why shouldn't she take revenge? Look at what we've done to her, he told us. And in my heart, all of a sudden, the shaved and the long-bearded, the Hindu and the Muslim, Kedar and Kalu, appeared united by a millennial wisdom, surely beyond my grasp, yet almost palpable vis-à-vis the spectacle of the 2 rivers in rage. Only returning from one of the charred sand islands, only returning from one of the chars on the last day of our trip, did Kedar reveal that among the displaced we had spoken to, struggling to transform virgin land into fields of paddy and vegetables, a few were actually professional thieves. Both from Jamuna-prone Saryakandi and the unruly Ganges Char, or islands, people move. Many leave for good, knowing that a wave too big could wash away their hamlet. Others go and return according to the seasons. Why their stories aren't in the book? I could say the initial exchange didn't flourish. We didn't manage to break the ice, and it wouldn't be a lie. Yet in reality, between us stood the ecocide. I couldn't make myself listen to development refugees like to normal people on the move, not with Jamuna before my eyes. Sorry. Oh, pardon. We have a technical problem. I think I lost the Bluetooth.
Yeah, probably. We should probably reconnect, but
You have to do it for me.
no, it should, I think it was done. I didn't know.
Yeah? But these are men. Women are much slower and they're paid less because of that. by time, by the speed in which they can forge a brick. So the stronger you are, the faster you can fill this shape, this mold, and the more you are paid. And that's another reason why men and women are, of course, not paid the same wage. So there should have been the stories of at least one laborer, or ideally of an entire family of laborers, in one of the many brick kilns of the Jessel region in Bangladesh, or of North 24 Parganas in West Bengal. Yet between 2012 and 2013, due to a recent government act aiming to safeguard the environment from the polluting emissions of outdated kilns, the manufacturers on Bangladesh's side suspected every outsider to be a reporter or an environmental activist, and literally boycotted each of our efforts, either discouraging the workers from talking with us or forbidding entrance. All I was able to gather in scattered chats was that those who joined the kilns at inception of the dry season come from the most depressed areas of the country, not only from Kurigram district to the north, where seasonal famine is still a reality, but also from the southern Shakira, devastated by Eliza cyclone in 2009. They would attempt the risky and physically consuming tasks that are part of the manufacturing process of bricks for 4 to 6 months, whereby various evidences hinted at regimes of bonded labor. In West Bengal, access was not an issue, but it soon stood out that apart from the local day laborers, the kilns have for centuries relied on specialized workers from Uttar Pradesh in the northern part of India. Here, I had to capitulate vis-à-vis the language barrier because I don't speak either Hindi or Urdu. The lack of language skills turned out a fatal limitation also in approaching the Adivasi or Aborigines or original inhabitants, and the Adivasi women who, like Soinjuddin and his gang, traveled to Bardhaman for the harvest, and differently from Adivasi families that had settled down permanently and meanwhile populated the fringes of many villages in the district, spoke and understood Santali and broken Hindi. The cultivators told us that only older laborers could speak Bengali. We retrieved some names and contacts and soon visited the Adivasi Para, or neighborhood, in the village of Supur, Bankura. There, the reports about extreme discrimination and socio-economic depression of the original inhabitants of the subcontinent took material shape, a materiality itself all broken. Sun-crept red soil and the minuscule cracked clay houses, the minuscule newborns whom skinny mothers couldn't breastfeed, the unreal silence in which adults and aged lay on the ground of their unlit huts, enduring the heat. But in spite of the pervasive poverty, the majority of them had stopped moving for work. The jobs created within the Rural Employment Guarantee Act by the Indian government, combined with the traditional activities like stock rearing and cigarette manufacturing, allowed them to make a living. Hadn't I decided to represent individual storytellings, some of the plays or of the chapters could be choral stories of villages and towns literally organized around movement. This would have told of places like Ashaura in Bangladesh northern district Sunamganj, where those who don't leave for good fluctuate between Desh and Videsh according to the Howard cycles. At the latest in May, when it fills with waters coming from the Himalayas, the men seek for work opportunities elsewhere and stay away for 5 to 6 months. Stories like the stories of the southeastern town of Kagratchari, the seasonal destination of impoverished migrants from the northwestern Kurigram, or like the wealthy village of Raina in West Bengal's rice bowl in Bardhaman district that attracts crowds of laborers from Murshidabad, Purulia, or Bansura in the harvest periods, but is progressively losing its local population to the bigger cities. Or like the many villages of West Bengal, where marriages are celebrated, houses renovated, and new assets purchased when the men return from South India. Failures, we recorded many, on a regular basis, most banally due to the difficulty to convey that my agenda was purely scientific. Illegitimate and irrational as it may be, the expectation of an entire hamlet, mothers and fathers, girls, elderly, toddlers, reunited around one, presuming she might have access to NGO or foreign development funds, is heavy to bear and to dash, especially vis-a-vis the existential struggle that is pervasive. Afterwards, every effort at overcoming the delusion was useless, in particular if I had not had enough time to build confidence with one definite person within a crew, and we arrived at our home village, often after consuming trips, exhausted and obviously disoriented. A different but related kind of expectation was that with which Dulal faced me at a progressed stage of our relationship. In late 2013, manic travels between Dhaka and Shadipur and very long stays at the village behind us, he asked me to lend him 5,000 taka, some 45 euros, to buy a larger quantity of vegetables and hopefully upscale his business. He legitimated the request, arguing that meanwhile he considered me to be his own sister, Alva. I didn't have such an amount with me and suggested that I would think about it and possibly give him the money 1 week later. Shirin, a woman educated at a nearby town whom the in-laws had forbidden to work after marriage, now, after their passing away, took the liberty to hang around in the market area of the village, had however told me that the local businessman on whom Dulal normally relied for the market purchases, asking for money or borrowing money, had recently challenged him. If his friendship with me were as close as he claimed, he said, I wouldn't deny. She had referred to the anecdote not to warn me against a possible request on Dulal's part, but in the course of a discussion around the omnipresent evil of Bengal, envy. Left to deal with the matter alone, I failed to analyze it rationally. All of a sudden, I wished I could be regarded as researcher and not as sister. I blamed the perception of foreigners as benefactors and damned all my cohabitation that had not led anywhere else than where everybody ends up being asked for money. Back in Dhaka, I could neither resolve to simply give him the money, nor to say I didn't want to affect the balances in the village community, nor to explain that the latent emotional blackmail that underlay his request put me in an impossible place. I just avoided the subject. Long, stubbornly, insincerely enough that he dropped it. The most miserable failure I have to report was, however, with Milan, whereby I blame myself less for having made mistakes that were due to lack of orientation in the liminal world he brought me to, than for not sticking by the norms governing the social, also gender, relations of the steadfast village he lived in. I introduce him as the person to whom I hold the two most breathtaking landscape experiences of the whole fieldwork. It was he who, in the last days of November 2012, made us acquainted with the fauna and flora of that hour, which I can't describe but with the word miracle. And he, for whom we landed in Bolaganj, number 10, a remote sand and stone extraction site along the border of Bangladesh with Meghalaya in India. The inhabitants of Ashaura had told us that those who move in and out the Howard basin generally return in November, when it becomes possible to make a life with fishing, unless the enclosures put in place by the wealthy families and firms that increasingly purchase leases from the state prevent access. Kalyakuta, which surrounds the thin sand island on which Milan stayed with his family and some other 50 Hindu households, as well as on the north side of the bipartite island, a slightly bigger Muslim community, hadn't been grabbed yet, and nonetheless he usually spent also the winters away from home, specifically in Bolaganj. There, he told us, he achieved larger profits than in the southern Feni, where he'd work as a harvest helper through the summer and rainy seasons, because his function at the mining site was that of shordar, or labor leader. He was going to depart with his workers just 2 days later, and didn't have anything against taking us along. We, however, had travelled uninterruptedly and gone through some trouble in the previous week, so it was agreed we'd join him a little later. On December 6th, via Sylhet and Companyganj, we reached the site. Breathtaking in Bolaganj number 10 doesn't apply to the landscape alone. The spectacle of mountains and dunes, of hundreds of unbelievably long, elegant boats filled with stones and pebbles of different color and size, seemingly floating on crystalline rivulets, and of the ethereal ensembles of semi-cylindrical tents made of bamboo and bright tarpaulin sheets, is still vivid before my inner eye. But the wild cruelty we started to apprehend after having surpassed the last hut of the border guards, its red-green flag waving humbly before the bluest of skies, was overwhelming. Contemplating the scene, which recalled Sebastião Salgado's photographs in Peru's gold mines, if not Dante's Inferno, I told Ashik, my assistant, "We've left the realm of control. Here, everything is possible." From the crassest exploitation of male, female, and child laborers, climbing up and down funnel-shaped poles of up to 15 meters, to unload baskets of stones and sand 12 or more hours per day, without minimal security measures and not even a field hospital. To the illegal destruction of nature, visible in the bomb-gutted flanks of the hills close by. To promiscuous and even illicit sex, denoted by a large number of unattended babies and small children, and revealed at Milan stand, where we understood two young hijra or androgynous persons or transsexual persons or third gender persons had been recruited to take care of the household, but also to satisfy the crew sexually. The challenges I was to face in the next minutes and hours will sound familiar to fellow researchers. Should I go on with Milan, whom we now knew to be an agent of bonded labor, if on the bottom rung of the ladder, and not a normal seasonal laborer? Could we talk about everything without arousing the local bosses' suspicions? Would they at all be afraid of environmental or labor rights activists? how to cope with allusions, gazes, and even open propositions in what seemed to be the country's most erotically loaded place. I can't say I felt in danger as a woman, and as a woman, I counted on the fact that bosses would not see a threat in my presence. Nonetheless, I decided we wouldn't spend the night at the camp, and that was probably a good decision. As regards Milan, after reasoning that his exploiter's job didn't invalidate the motives of my original interest in him, that is, living a highly translocalized life, I resolved to continue, accepting that it was his right not to disclose everything too quickly. Later on, I have often wondered whether I should have been, already at that point, more resolute and less optimistic, because I lacked the resoluteness to ask for time for life storytellings from him. The extreme context inhibited me, and at the same time, I was over-reliant on my capability to sooner or later crack his code. He, on the contrary, stood me up in March, when I had hoped to document his experiences in Spain. At least, he seemed happy to see me when I returned to his jar in November, 1 year after we had first met. That he smelled of alcohol, and this early in the morning, didn't bother me too much. Instead of a chic, I was now accompanied by Hans, who was helping me with the work on the landscape videos. Soon, Milan asked what my friend would drink at night, and I condescended to his plan to buy some bottles of local wine, although I knew our drinking together was going to break the norms of the village community, and specifically the boundaries set by patriarchy. Why? Because like I had felt guilty of wrong moralism, condemning his role as a labor leader or bonded labor leader, I feared to commit a similar mistake, refusing to drink with him, because since our contact had not come about directly, but via a local reporter of the district, who was a remote cousin, and I had long described to this involuntary encounter Milan's difficulties to understand my interest in his community, so I hoped this would be his way to inaugurate a friendship, for sheer curiosity, in the name of subversion. Probably for all of these impulses together, scarce resoluteness and exaggerate optimism included, whereby musing about reasons is rather pointless. The destructive consequences of my decisions show that it was simply wrong of me. The rest of the story, namely, can be summed up as follows. Milan and two fellows of his drank a lot. We skipped various rounds or filled our glasses with water instead of the deadly alcohol. A senior relative inspected the hut with reprimanding air, yet no words. And Milan's wife endured the whole situation locked in a similar silence. When it was time to go to sleep, and I was on my way to the makeshift toilet behind the house, Milan attempted an approach that with my much bigger body size, I could oppose. Hold up. I was enraged and consulted Hans. To avoid a public confrontation, whose implications for Milan and his family I couldn't foresee, I opted to leave the house. The next morning, at the first azan, or the Muslim prayer, we stood up and furtively left. Fled the Shah, its introverted community that had not even begun to open up, but at least was beginning to communicate like thieves. Thank you.
For this make this distinction between the academic research and a practical one?
I wonder still, I mean, I was not trained an anthropologist or a sociologist. My training was in literature. I studied comparative literature and didn't want to do literature studies anymore, but started to make documentary films. And that's how I arrived to Bangladesh the first time, in the context of a small project of the Goethe Institute. And I never did the film because, eventually I wanted to make a film on Dhaka. I never did the film, I did a PhD on the city. And I have continued to struggle with the difficulty of relating to a lot of other subjects, because all of a sudden I was dealing with urban studies, even with planners that were asking me, what do you want to tell us about the development of the city, find solutions, and don't speak about the people, or this is difficult to implement. And also the colleagues in the anthropological and sociological departments that were not satisfied with my very basic bottom line, that was, methods. I need to learn how to make an interview, I need to learn which mistakes not to make, I need to know how to consider the class divide, I have to know what it means to work in a post-colonial context, and on the other hand, I am relating to people. And this is a human experience. I am devising ways to overcome lack of trust, to overcome a lot of pictures that normally risk to undermine an encounter, and on the other hand, you always fail also in this effort at encountering someone. The comment of my second supervisor to the PhD, the last line was, so she made everything wrong, she doesn't say how she did the research, she didn't apply this method, the method was oral histories. She didn't apply it properly, and she also didn't read it properly, because she's not able to describe what this method consists of. But she managed to gather a lot of stories, and eventually she decided to give me the highest mark. That was long ago. The fact that I had been able to convince a hardcore anthropologist that, in spite of the fact that I had made a mess, still didn't affect the quality of the stories that I had been able to gather and to bring back, made me very stubborn, and I decided, okay, if I am to stay in this field of research, and I wanted to, because actually I didn't have any answers after that PhD, I had more questions. I am not going to do it with this very blind understanding of, I have to be scientific and I have to legitimize what I'm doing, I have to be sure about what I'm doing, I have to collect comparable data, and this has to be transparent. There is a question of transparency, but for me it becomes more importantly a question of honesty. And then there is a question of language. And the language not in the sense of learning a language to speak with someone, or not only also of how do I speak and how does that impact on the conversation, but also of the language I use when I write about the fieldwork. And luckily, since many years, since already the 60s, you can say, there are a lot of ethnologists, anthropologists, and writers stubborn and curious enough, and also bold enough to challenge this understanding that you have to be scientific because you are going in the jungle and you have to come back with comparable data, and say fieldwork and anthropology, ethnology. I mean, in English-speaking context, and ethnology is not even a subject, but ethnology, anthropology, sociology, these are disciplines of the logos. And the logos doesn't mean only the logic, it also means the language with which we convey what we have found. And this means also that we have to be very sensitive in using our language, and that means to be poetic and not to be logic in the way we write. And so I would say I have taken a lot of, I have felt encouraged by many other very, very good examples that are always a little bit, you know, the outsiders of literature, and the outside because they don't write novels, and the outsiders of anthropology because they don't write data, don't bring back data, but that find a niche. And I cannot but say that there is no contradiction between making research and wanting to report about it, and recurring or revolving to a poetic language, because we have to find other ways to explain the real. I mean, it is really a question of reality. Conceptualizing it with Walter Benjamin, it would become a question that also the avant-gardes have always, or have long asked themselves: how do you, as a materialist or as a left-thinking intellectual, relate yourself with the worker, or with the proletariat, or with the working class? You want to be beside them, but it is impossible. It is the impossible position that I mentioned when I spoke about the conflict or the situation with Roulard. He put me in the impossible position of being his sister, and I am impossibly going to be his sister. If I pretend to be, and that was my mistake, I am eluding, forgetting, undermining, and in that moment also missing the possibility to denounce the fact that there is a class divide. It's not the gender, it's not the caste, religion, it's not a colonial divide, it's a class. And Walter Benjamin says the artist and the intellectual, and for him it doesn't make a difference whether it is the intellectual, the academic intellectual, or the artist. Walter Benjamin says it is an impossible position to locate ourselves beside them. We have to be able to show the means of production of our knowledge and of our access also to the worker, or to the subalternized, to the discriminated woman, whatever. So for me it becomes a question of showing showing how we generate this, and also showing how inhabitation and cohabitation of a social space that is very ephemeral and total and can always, you know, flip, how it can happen, and how an encounter is possible. In that moment you make a step to overcome that divide, and for a moment. And sometimes it has an effect, a long-lasting, mostly for yourself. Sometimes it has a wider effect. Sometimes it triggers processes in a community. And that's why it is always a question of finding another way to convey these things. And a poetic or artistic expression. I mean, I only have the word, others have video, have painting, have, I mean, what photography, I mean, that's important. That is the only way to create another narrative, or break at least the hegemonial one.
I have one question, because one of the things that we've been looking at this year, and the reason that for us this year was called Uncommon, was actually looking at these gaps, because I think a lot of times there's sort of an instant urge to look for the commonality, to find the common ground, to find this connection, and sometimes there could be another way, because I think this tends to blanket over some things, and actually how to acknowledge the gaps, the missings, and kind of coming back also to what we've been looking at, like this idea of the void. Sometimes when you leave empty spaces, because I think that often conditioning, so we all have conditioning, that predetermines our thought processes around even judgments of class, all of this, and our next topic coming up next month, as well as this strange stranger, that when we start to look at the strangeness within ourselves, there actually becomes to identify, we tend to kind of put it all outside, you know, very often, and think that, you know, these ideas of other, or in this kind of class separations, or sort of who's the master, who's the slave, trying to look at kind of playing all these, there's all of these stories going on that have also, in theory, been also looked at quite closely. And I think there's also another point of the intimacy that just happens. So you don't necessarily have, and it's not that it's common. I mean, this is the other thing. It's not that intimacy or this vulnerability or this empty space that exists between people without language is necessarily a commonality. But how to be with that emptiness, because sometimes I wonder, we're so quick to kind of fill it with this poetic place, because there's a story that needs to be told. So on one hand, and you know, can jump, you know, this, how stories are very necessary to be told. But on the other hand, sometimes just that being with someone without trying to identify a story or buy into their story, or have them buy into your story. You know?
Totally. I mean, the book, totally my struggle, and totally my thinking, and the question of showing the cohabitation is for me. I mean, when we inhabit a space, we don't necessarily are close to each other. We just share one space, and starting from that picture that I can temporarily cohabit the space of temporary migrants and of people that temporarily inhabit spaces. Taking off from that image, I did this field work, and I was resolute in the wish and in the plan not to come back and tell the stories myself, because then I have kind of again filled the gap. And the story was that I thought, okay, I have cohabited the space, because the space doesn't mean, I mean, cohabiting doesn't mean that I coincide or I become coincident with the other. We have a space. And what I did in this book is, apart from an introduction, there is an author's note, which is a kind of user's guide, and there is a small introduction, and there is this. And then there is a wider second part, which is related to urbanization. But the book, the real book, is 9 chapters, which are theater plays. The persons, I mean, 9 persons that are traveling, each of them has their own play. And in the play, they speak as they spoke to me, but they are telling their stories. And then there is me asking something and also not understanding it, and then they tell me, idiot, I say something else. And then there are sometimes also other persons that are interacting with them. In order to make this accessible on one hand, and also in order to structure it, I then introduced a narrator, very neutral. In my mind it was, or in my imagination it was a geographer that explains where we are. And a conscience, because in the Bengali folk tradition, there is still a form of theater that is moving. It is called jatra, and jatra means travel or journey. And this folk theater has something that reminded me of the Corifeo. It is not the narrator, there is another extra person that speaks to the audience and is the conscience and tells them, do you see what is happening? It is an epic agent in Brecht's sense, right? And he comes out and he say, I mean, in the folk stories, in the folk theater plays, he really looks different, and or she, I mean, it is very unclear who she or he is, and this guy speaks to the audience. But normally, because these stories traditionally are religious, there would be a question of morality. I mean, the consciousness is moral.
So would you say like you have layers of
Yeah,
translation in terms of like different...
Exactly. I introduced this conscience that continuously is between, that continuously highlights the misunderstandings, that continuously highlights what cannot be said. Whether I can explain it, not they can, nor they can explain it, and it remains a question. But at least his function is really to lay bare that we don't know what to do, and we also don't know how to relate to each other, or to relate to that, to the situation in which we are overwhelmed, or in which something happens that is an accident or an unforeseen case, and everybody is just, you know, frozen and or stares and doesn't know what to say. So he helped me also structurally, very practically. He helped me to link things or to comment in another voice. But I think of Cautious as a man also, and yeah, because Vivek is a male name in Hindi, so that's why. This person helped to continuously make the space open and show we are not close, we are not coincident, we don't even go parallel to each other. We're totally divergent, and we really don't know how to converge again and be again in this space of cohabitation. And it makes it, it was extremely difficult to write, because you have the question of consciousness has a language, and he is very bold and stubborn, and sometimes speaks bullshit or speaks a little bit unclear. The narrator has a very plain language, and then each of the 9 persons doesn't only have an accent or a dialect, but they also have their favorite expressions. They have different age, so they speak also with more or less modern terminologies. So there was a very long process of language work with all these registers. But I hope let's say that I tried, and I hope it worked in a way. Maybe it's even too much one-to-one, but it was my way to say to keep the difference and the gap continuously alive. But because it is totally true. Also, when I started to say I recollect stories, many friends told me, yeah, watch out, because storytelling is overused. And when the artist or the writer comes back and she says, I have storytelling, she's actually rewritten everything, and she, you know, suggests these are stories, but it's again someone that writes for those that cannot write or cannot speak. Thinking
This is
about
a
that.
constant, don't you think that also this is kind of a constant, that people are always inventing or reinventing, you know, themselves, the idea of themselves, the idea of the world, the idea of the
But then laid bare, because we are not doing anything else. I mean, I cannot even give a projection of Durga, of Milan. I mean, I don't even know. Do you know? I am cohabiting or struggling to cohabit. So rather than saying this is Milan, I rather let him speak and everybody else can read it, and then also can read how I'm not understanding him in the point, and maybe I'm also understanding him. And then really increase very, very strongly the possibility of a reinterpretation or also of misunderstanding, and then the storytelling is turned something else, and it is actually the sharing of a stage.
But the interesting part in this is, if I've understood correctly, that all these levels of interpretation, when you presented them, people asked for your voice as well. So what is missing in this story is what you just read. Because you had all these levels of interpretation, but then still it's not only about writing a methodology, but bringing your own voice again in, and that was even asked for. That's an interesting part of
it was, I say that it was a very hard work of the language. It was also very hard work to separate myself from my language. Because of course, even this consciousness is not always saying what I mean, it is not that I say, I put what I think and my interpretation into this. So yeah, and there was this problem that people that read it initially, some of the initial chapters of these, some of the initial plays, say, yeah, you know, I miss your voice because you can write, and I want to know what you make with it. And that's why there is not only this chapter that is untold stories, there is this introduction, there is another chapter, and there is eventually I kind of treated it badly, and it is not true that I don't like the second part, but I really reappropriated my language in the second part of the book. I read it, I mean, for myself, it needed, at this stage of my understanding of how I can deal with this other non-shareable space, was to separate and to have a blank page. I mean, depending on how we design the book, but I think there will be just a blank page or something else. And then there is a very long chapter that is a theoretical chapter, but I didn't write it in an academic way. I mean, I'm trying seriously to draw some conclusions, but I didn't renounce the poetic language. So it comes. I promise. My voice is there, but I mean, fieldwork is in a way. It is very much a self experience. That's why I say it is addictive, but it is also separating from yourself. You have to at some point. But if it is also only for the empathy that you try to feel with the other.
You need that to get a story at
Yes.
all.
Yes, exactly.
If
Yeah.
you don't, you won't.
Yes. Otherwise, people will not share.
Exactly. I have a question, and it's totally in another alley, but I was very intrigued by the beginning because you show pictures, and besides the water, another theme that I see in the pictures is walls, that you're kind of fascinated with the walls, and then in the beginning of the text you talk about that you are tested on your capacities and driven to your limits. And I'm thinking, what is the space in between those two, like capacity and limits? And what is behind the walls that you're showing?
First of all, I have to apologize. I didn't. I put these photos because I like them, but I never reflected. Why
Yeah, but you tell them they have a story.
Each of them has a story, but I didn't have it. I would say I didn't. I mean, it's the first time someone is attracting my attention on the walls. I mean, it is a very nice observation, and I don't have an answer for.
Because you have
the
like
picture of the wall,
but wall, and then you have like a brick wall with holes in, and then you show the brick maker making bricks for walls, and then you also show a lot of like polished walls, and then you talk about like going like showing your capacity and being driven to your limit. Also through the text, I think like. India is a testing place, and yeah, I'm just intrigued by the pictures about the walls, because in particular there's this straw wall in the beginning with something on it, and well, when I see a wall, I can't help asking what's behind it.
That is a house wall, and actually that photo has a totally different duration. And I was fascinated by the fact that they build walls of houses with straw. So for me, it is a very important photo because, and I have a collection of these photos, and of all other materials, whether it is the bamboo, the young bamboo that is threaded, and they make.
Feet in the material, you had it as well.
Yeah, that is another issue, yeah. But there are so many materials that we tend to call them ephemeral materials, but they are to a point processed in order to be resilient. I mean, one of these walls, when they make it, lasts for 5 years, 7 years, and it's cheaper than the aluminium, and of course than the bricks. So a lot of villages are still made of these materials and have this haptic and climatically very beautiful atmosphere to them. A series of pictures, of photos, really has to do with a very constant theme, which is habitation, and also in its materiality. Because I've always been fascinated, maybe this is a big nostalgia of home, but I love and I feel extremely drawn to homes and to ways to make home. So that for the other are there are walls, there are many walls, that's true.
Well, maybe that will answer that question actually just right there on the wall, because it's like you make a straw wall, it has a capacity of being a wall, but its limit is that it's not going to grow. And maybe that is
but then it's going to be, the beauty of this. I don't promote every wall negatively. I can imagine that in your perception it can have, and also combined with what I say, that it can have the suppressing or the limiting function, but as you say, that wall is not going to be there forever. These have the beauty that they're going to be remade, and they are made, but normally it's a job that they still do at home.
Well, this temporality and the porosity that you were talking about before, because I think it's porosity, and if you're thinking about this movement, and again, why that's interesting, or why people are looking at it, well, because actually there's never been movement. Like there's not really a status that is constant. So I think also this framing with this temporality, but that's also, I think that again the conditioning tends to put either a negativity to that or an alarm to that, but actually there's a consistency to the temporality.
Yeah, that's true. But I want to go back to that because it is helping me. I am not sure whether this is my final answer, but a tentative answer to the question of walls as a limit, pushing oneself to her limits, could be that the addiction that I have is about not necessarily going beyond the limit. Actually, it is to know where it is. Subversion is not yet something that I want to dare. Most of all because in the fieldwork that I do, or in the circumstances in which I throw myself, one takes time and must take time to understand where can you really subvert something, or where can you break the rules. And sometimes you break the rules in the wrong moment, and then you have a disaster. But it is very much to know which are the limits in dealing with myself, dealing with another, and dealing with the question also with dealing with very practical things. I mean, how is it possible that we live in these houses? Can I live like this? Can I learn to bathe without a bathroom or without a shower? These things. So it's a constant touching limitations, but only in order to become acquainted with them, so to not be afraid of them. And there is capacity. Yeah, that is why I say it is a question, a process of self-cognition, very much. But I have to say, and I really will not make it again, I didn't compose them thinking of the effect of each of the photos with the other. I just chose them because they are important for me. So the next step would be to reassemble them, thinking of what they do with each other. I admit,
because there are quite some themes, and like I think there are like materials, and there are nature, and there are water, and there are friendship, and there are like really strong themes. Family is also a strong theme.
Yeah, thank you. I will have to really watch them again and think of the cross relationship.
I would have a footnote question, that how many walls did you photograph in previous projects where you might not have worked so much with architects? Does that have a, because I know some photographs, walls, everything.
Whether it is the proximity with, I don't know, because my previous work was without photos. I have a very shabby camera, and I have not yet learned that it is important to take photos, for example. I was always very shy and very reluctant to take photos of people. Then the question is how to photograph poverty, and you don't want to go back, and everybody says, they're so poor. You also don't want to romanticize it, you don't want to aesthetize it. I would never be able to make, photos from the top and everything looks clean, because from high you don't see the rubbish. So I never did photos before actually starting to work with you. And when you and Boris told me, you have to make more photos because otherwise we don't have anything to work with, I really pushed myself. But I think maybe the problem is that I was already pre-influenced by architects, and I started to have a special attention for walls. But the materialities have always fascinated me in this place. Especially Bangladesh, because towards West Bengal, moving to West, basically this Bay of Bengal, or this delta, means that the entire land is sedimentation land that has for hundreds, thousands, millennia actually been carried via these rivers. So it's not soil, it's not rock, it's sand, it's sediments, it's then of course clay, and it becomes more and more clay and red clay towards the west, but in Bangladesh it's really sand and grayish, and everything is, you know, because you walk and a lot of streets are still not cemented or paved. You walk slower. I have always photographs of my feet, for example. Always, not because I like my feet, because for me it was always important, how am I walking? Because a lot of my fever was walk. I mean, we did a lot of things walking and not, of course we took a lot of other means of transportation, but we spent a lot of time walking, and a lot of trips were covered, a lot of distances were covered with walking, and then you pass from the city to another road, and to another road, and then there is a path, and then there is water, and that has always occupied me. So, but and this sand, the fact that the soil is sandy and that it can see that any moment that you drench in it or that you soak in it has always fascinated me. It's always also made me think of the you know it, there is a beautiful, I mean, in Bengali there are two words that are kacha and paka, and kacha means raw, but it also is the non-paved street, and the non-brick house, a house like that with a straw is kacha, and a house that is built with solid materials is paka, which means cooked. I also cook the food, I also say I make it paka. So the distinction is passing something from the natural status to something where it is solid. But the focus is on what is wet actually, or what is kacha.
Process of
Yeah. And from the very beginning of learning this language and coping with this very non-solid or very non-solidity of a lot of things around us, and the fact that everything else is paka. I mean, everything is. I mean, a house in bricks is cooked or solid. I mean, the food becomes solid then. I mean, how is the food solid? So no, so the food is only processed. But do I want to say that the street is processed? So, I have not found a perfect translation for these two words that are always in a very interesting kind of relationship. And because the climate, because the environment gives that another notion of the non-cooked or the raw. So densification or condensification. Something's and that has always. I mean, from the very beginning, I know that I have written notes about the soil, the sand, the bricks. I mean, that is always that I'm sure I was from the very beginning from my notes in the diary. That I know that it has always fascinated me. The bamboo. I mean. Maybe it was also the influence of architects. But I really cannot answer that because I don't have a lot of comparison.
Maybe we have time for one more last question. Everybody like to ask something?
Yes. Since you were criticizing this positive result-oriented scientific methodology, I was kind of wondering, do you think this criticism only works because everyone around you is working like this in this methodology? Or do you think this methodology is also necessary as a complementary?
Yeah.
And
okay. I think it is very necessary. I mean, you cannot. I am not against methods. I am against overestimating them and methodologizing what we do. I mean, each of us, I think that each of us, in order to tackle many things, also in everyday life, have their own tactic that at some point, because we repeat them until, I mean, at some point we are adults, we have ways to do things, and they become a kind of a strategy, and they solidify. So, and and in that sense, I think that also when you do fieldwork and you do it for some years, you find ways to do things, and you have to also be very careful and conscious about these methods, because they, like it happened to me many times, you forget them and then everything goes wrong. But you know also what works well, why stories happen. So you know what to do, and you have to be careful also, because otherwise you are uncritical about your production. So every method is not to be blamed, and actually each one has to devise their method, but I am against institutionalizing method to the point that everybody should, comply with a prescription or with a methodology, because, okay, if I am working with grounded theory, I have to use this and this, and then the codifying, because I have to codify, I mean, this is also a thing. You do your fieldwork already thinking that you have to codify it, or to code it. And thinking of the process of coding, you formulate the questions that you want to ask people, because they have to be codable and decodable, and this means that because you have a prefixed understanding of the steps that lead you to producing knowledge, you industrialize it to a point that it becomes very homogeneous, and we don't produce difference, but we produce homogeneity. So the methods are not the problem. Did I misunderstand the question?
No, it's good. It's just, I think it doesn't lead to homogeneity, it leads to comparability.
To a point. I mean, I must ensure that I can compare things that I am asking and things that I'm finding within each other, I mean, within the context of the research I'm doing. So I must be, it is, I would fail if, since each of the person is totally different, I would not stick to a certain number of methods or of devices or of procedures with which I get or I gather sets of answers or types of answers, or also materials like a mental map or like a drawing, or some of the photos are also not shot by my assistant but by my participants. I mean, they at some point were curious about the camera, and then I would ask them to photograph something. So by default, they would also photograph me, but they would also photograph other things. And then I would try to spend time analyzing these photos. One thing I mentioned here was that Hans helped me and actually gave me the hint to try to make landscape videos. I mean, we shot videos that were then showed to the persons so that they speak about these things, and it had to do with the fact that I wanted originally to speak about the landscape and the space that the territories that they travel through while traveling. But we were always moving on, on very congested means of transportation, or on the rooftop of a bus or of a train, or on a boat, and you can't. Physically, you don't have space, and actually, practically, you really have to hold yourself to make a conversation like that. And I really wanted to know how and whether and how they perceive the space the distances that they straddle from the perspective of movement, and then we devised something. So it is not about not creating methods. I have to be able to devise methods in order to have a comparable set of things that allows me to say something, but I am against this that I've devised being used by you in your next field where you are somewhere else, where because you look different, because you have a different age, because you have other assets that I don't have, limits you. And this is the problem. I mean, it is not the method, it is necessary to create a comparability, but the problem is that if everybody uses the same method because they believe this is the right one, they don't produce anything that is comparable across fieldworks. So it is a problem or a struggle I have with the methodologization of ethnography, not with the methods per se.
Can I pick up just? I find this very beautiful. So I think this struggle to kind of striving for a certain method, striving for a certain procedure, for a certain algorithm in doing things, and then on the other hand, to have this kind of poetic storytelling, and kind of always being in between and valuing both sides. I find this very beautiful. So I think this is exactly what is necessary today to have this kind of schizophrenic or kind of so you need the objectivity, but you know that this fieldwork is never objective. So it's, and then if you are into storytelling, then you are kind of lost. So what's your feeling, for instance, with this? Have you read this Empire of Science? For me, this is a kind of a very beautiful example how to pick up both. So this is Ronald Barthes going to Japan, and then he says, "Oh, I went to Japan. Now I tell a story on Japan." And this is a very fictional story, so it's my projection on Japan. But he is projecting all his sophistication, everything he learned, in the most complex way. So he's into science, so he said this is an empire of science, it's not Japan, it's an empire of science because I love science, science is me.
But on the other side, because he cannot read Japanese,
Exactly,
everything is also science, there is no written word, there is no scripture anymore, there is only sign. So the beautiful, the book is beautiful. I mean, I think that is why I say this is the only solution or the best solution I could find at this stage. If I had kind of a fixed idea or a fixed theory, like Roland Barthes when he goes to Tokyo, and I am already for many years working only on the sign, then I would, allow myself to do this exercise, but I don't have one thing that
for me it looks like that in the struggle between these two, when you are in this, so you appreciate both, so the poetic moment and the objective moment, and you don't know how to negotiate them. If you have a strong vector of your own interest, and then you project the strong vector of your own interest, then it's able to rotate both and make a kind of
that is why, I mean, I am not at this stage of my of my progress as a researcher or as a thinker or as a whatever. I don't have that vector. I mean, I don't have one clear vector of what I'm up to. I am still in this phase in which I have a lot of questions. I am really keen in understanding the relationship between inside, outside, city, country, that became in the last years movement. Probably movement is going to be for some time a vector. Movement in itself is vectorial or vectoral, and that may have another very interesting kind of effect. But yeah, I am not yet Roland Barthes in Tokyo. But I love that book.
No, I mean, I'm just asking because I have similar struggles, and I find this very beautiful because I think this is what these times are actually about, that we have this schizophrenic moment between these two lines, and how to struggle, how to negotiate, this I find very beautiful.
And you can probably push the storytelling so far that you can still defend yourself in front of the institutionalized scientific world. and everything beyond this will not be taken, you know, as then you're more too much in the storytelling, and you won't be serious.
I hope it is going to work. Let's see when it comes out, and when people who are much less generous than you will start to write reviews. But I don't know, but I found it an honest way, let's say. So,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.